You also want to make me a co-host in case somebody would come in while you're, my guess is everybody's here who's going to be here.
All right, welcome. I'm just going to sit in right here so you can hear me okay. And before I start the video, this week's discussion is about the idea of me and we. And so we're going to kind of look at individualism and the influence of individualism on how we read the Bible. So I'm going to lead us in an opening prayer. Loving God, by tender words and covenant promise, you've joined us to yourself forever, and you invite us to respond to your love with faithfulness. By your Spirit, may we live with you and one another in justice, mercy, and joy. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. Amen. And I'm going to get the video started, and so we can watch this now.
I'm going to turn off my speaker.
Welcome back to this fourth episode of Earthbound. We have heard God's call to be co-creators with God, gifted with powers to change the world, powers that need to be used with love and care. You know, what happens here on our earthly home matters profoundly to our Creator God, who dwells in creation. Now, in this session, we'll step back to look at our understanding of our identity and the consequences of that identity for our relationship with the whole of creation.
We in the West have a very well-developed concept of individual identity, that I am my own person endowed with human and civil rights for my protection. Somehow we've turned that emphasis on individual rights into the right to do anything we want as long as it's not illegal, without regard to whether or not it's good for anyone else. That distorted understanding of our identity has eroded our sense of responsibility, our calling to care for neighbor, including the non-human neighbor. How might we better understand our place in relationship to God's good creation? How might we broaden our calling to serve the common good of the whole earth community?
As far as I can tell, God wants for us to be living life abundantly, and that means with great joy and as part of community. As I see it, we're created in community and for community by community, and that community is not only human, but it's a web of life on earth.
So where in the world did this sense of radical individualism come from? Could it be yet another misreading of the Bible? Or did it leach into our identity much more recently?
One of the little textual problems is that in English, when you go to translate the Greek or the Hebrew, you cannot tell whether the pronoun you is singular or plural, and we often read it as singular when in fact it means you all or all of you.
And that there is definitely a corporate understanding of reality that permeates both testaments. And when we bring our cultural individualism, it's a misreading of the text.
Our justification by God's grace tells us without doubt that we are valued, personally. God's Word reminds us that we are each a vital part of a larger whole. Science also tells us that we are a part of a larger organic whole, and that what we do affects the greater creation in ways that we do not often see.
By nature, we are biosocial creatures. We are born to belonging. I mean, there isn't anything that we do as individuals which doesn't assume generations of knowledge. Furthermore, the planet has produced all of those materials for you. So what you do as an individual depends upon geologic processes, even cosmological processes about which you had absolutely nothing to do. So we're biosocial creatures to start with. And yet we have this notion that somehow or another it all comes to focus in us. It's all about me.
This radical individualism is deeply embedded in the American spirit. The 18th century age of enlightenment profoundly shaped our view of the individual in ways of which we are largely unaware.
And the Enlightenment is this discovery of the human individual and human power. And it works primarily through Descartes' thought experiment. What can he doubt? He can doubt all things except his own consciousness. So that isolates human mind from all else as object. In other words, now you've got a subject-object split in its mind over against matter. And then with the development of a lot of science and technologies, through this very powerful way of knowing, I can ask more and more powerful questions to take things apart as a subject inquiring about an object. It's a very powerful way of knowing that then with modern science you can formulate hypotheses and you can falsify, see if they're falsified, if the evidence hold up. That's all built on subject, knowing subject versus over against passive object, and nature is the passive object.
The big fear in the late 19th century was the human beings would simply become cogs in a machine. Science sort of looked at the world in the 18th century as a big machine, and if the world and the earth and all of the mechanisms of earth are a big machine, and humans are not distinguished from that, then they become simply a cog in the machine. The industrialization had happened. You had assembly lines and people screwing on bolt number 39 at station number 12, and there was a fear that humans would become part of an industrial and social and societal machine as well. And so in the 19th century there was this effort to distinguish human beings from nature and from this machine and from the industrial machine, and to talk about individuality and so on. And to do that, they distinguish between nature and consciousness, nature and spirit, nature and human beings, for very good reasons and very good purposes. But it had a downside, and the downside was that it severed that connection, or interconnected with that world from which they were distinguishing people.
In many circumstances, it's very good. It's a way of saying people both have rights, they cannot be simply stepped upon and oppressed, and they have responsibilities. So it was a good way to emphasize both claims that we make on life and our responsibilities for it. But when it becomes self-encased, it becomes an illusion and it becomes destructive, because what I then claim to do and have a right to do, if I don't think about the consequences for others, then it's destructive.
Where the danger comes in is that we focus too much on this understanding that the universe is made of isolated individuals, is made of isolated parts that have no connection, and the less connection you have, the truer it is, or the more pure it is. And so you have just automatically broken all relationship with other people, the rest of the world, the universe.
It renders all of nature, in effect, dead. It's resources, it's commodities, it's stage, it's dumpster, but it is not fellow subject. So the world then becomes a collection of objects rather than a communion of subjects.
The Bible has a very different understanding of our identity, an understanding that we need to rediscover if we are to live in right relationship to the earth.
I don't think that we are, from a biblical perspective, first and foremost individuals. God, obviously, in the beginning we see wanted us in community. We're called to love neighbor as self, or to love neighbor as God loves. These are all indications that we're part of a larger web. That doesn't mean we're not individuals and splendid as individuals, but that we are to function in ways that serve this broader web of life.
The great heresy of the modern world is indeed individualism, as though we are private operators.
I've had gripes even with people I deeply agree with when they start talking about, well, it's just my own personal behavior, and this does not affect anyone else. And I couldn't disagree more with my good friends. I say, there isn't a private ethic that way.
We have bought into this idea that my choices are mine alone. But that blinds us to the broader consequences of our actions upon others. And the victims of our earth-destructive lifestyle are invariably the poorest, the most vulnerable, the least equipped to cope. In Bishop Stephen Marsh's hometown of Robbins, Illinois, a very poor suburb of Chicago, a garbage incinerator was built with grave consequences.
Robbins decided to do this because they were so poor, and they claimed that they didn't have any other choice in terms of some income for the village. But that incinerator, since it's been there, has caused even higher rates of cancer, asthma, a sinus trouble, heart failures, that kind of thing. The health risks that have come with that have been devastating.
So poor communities are usually the recipients of dumping grounds, garbage dumps. Companies sometimes decide that they can pollute because the people that live there are not as important.
If I'm a person in Africa on a lake that has now dried up and it has provided the fish for my family for generations, I no longer have food. And that's because of global warming. Or if I'm in a part of Africa where malaria is on the rise because of global warming, we are responsible for that.
Unfortunately, this environmental discrimination is systemic to our modern world, fed by economics and globalization. But the Bible has an antidote to this kind of injustice.
Quite clearly, both the Old Testament and the New Testament is about having membership in a community, and God's commitment to us, God's covenant with us, is always a covenant with a community.
Part of it is overcoming some of our assumptions and cultural assumptions of what it means to be individuals and to have individual freedom, because it gets disconnected from the community somehow. So it seems to me the antidote to that is again going back to the scripture from the very beginning. It's not good that Adam be alone. There needs to have community. God sets about creating a community, the called people, the people of Israel. God calls together a people of the church in the New Testament. God uses community as the way to influence the rest of creation and the rest of the world. And so we're called into this nourishment, a mutual nourishment of community, and that's, I think, biblical and theological and Christian, and to some extent in tension with what it normally means to be American.
Sciences tell us we're not singularly individuals, but we're organisms connected to all the other organisms. But as I see it also, theology our faith tells us we're not individuals. I was asked to give a lecture a couple of years ago on what it means to be a Christian in the 21st century. And I thought, and then I thought, I think maybe there is no such thing as a Christian. Because in baptism, we're woven into a body. We become part of a body. So by our theological understanding of baptism, we're not singular, we're not individuals. And science tells us we're not. So why should we suppose that we are?
We were born into a world that has all of these intricate connections, and we're connected to it. And we have a responsibility for acknowledging the connections, celebrating the connections, and enhancing all of that to which we are connected, which are plants and animals and rocks and other humans and stars, and all of which is all connected together. And all has to be there in order to make it all go. All has to be there in order for us to live. So it's part of what we've been gifted with is this world to which we are also connected.
Farmers are earthbound in some very profound ways. They understand that they live and work in a world where they partner with natural processes to raise food and fiber for the benefit of the world.
Greg Massa and Raquel Kroc are both scientists and farmers, and know very well that they rely on complex ecological systems to produce rice and almonds.
I'm the fourth generation of my family to plant rice in California, so I grew up on the farm, family farm, but really wanted nothing to do with it. When I was in high school, I just saw it as a hot, dirty job. So I went away to college, went to the beach, UC Santa Barbara, and went into biology.
I grew up in Los Angeles in dead middle suburban city with a lot of smog. And except for the smog, I had no concept of environmentalism or agriculture.
Ended up being a tropical biologist in Costa Rica for about 5 years with Raquel.
I did have a very Christian home, and my dad was a horticulturalist, and so there was a lot of plant diversity and a strong passion for just how beautiful his plants were. I got into this marine biology class that was very hands-on, and they brought us fresh specimens from the water in UCSB. And I just was in awe, and I never looked back, because after that came entomology, and after that came ecology, and everything I did, I just kept marveling over. I spent hours over the microscope just so intrigued and impressed by these amazing little organisms.
Especially with our work in Costa Rica, we were working in a lowland rainforest research station that was basically an island out in the middle of cattle ranches and banana plantations. And so we were seeing the forest being cut down and all those animals and plants with nowhere to go.
We were also learning a lot about how it coexisted with people that lived right there.
We knew the people who were doing it, and we didn't want them to go hungry either.
Greg and Raquel knew that they didn't want to go back into academia, so they inquired about the possibility of returning to the family farm. Greg's family warmly welcomed them back in 1997. They started converting it to an organic farm soon after, a process that takes time and some risk to implement.
There's a 3-year transition period from the last time you put on a chemical fertilizer or an herbicide or whatever until you can become organic. So you have to have a transition period where you have to farm organically but can't call it organic. And that's the most difficult time. And you have to use that period of time to try to reduce your weed populations and get some biology back in your soil. So you start by applying compost, which has lots of bacteria and fungi and stuff that gets back into the soil that all those years of chemical farming has burned up. We plant cover crops, which have the ability to take nitrogen out of the air and put it back in the soil, and try to get the biology in the soil to come alive again.
For Greg's family and long-time conventional rice farmers, to switch over is a huge difference in the way you do things and the way you have to think about things.
Habitat destruction and loss of species was evident in their experience in Costa Rica, but it was also visible in their return to the Northern California farm.
We do have some of the same problems, like for instance here in California, We have these enormous oak trees that used to cover this valley, valley oaks, and wood ducks will nest in those cavities within those old trees. And there's a real shortage of those old trees now because they've mostly been cut down for farming and they're not being replaced. Most of the valley oaks now are pretty small. And so the wood ducks have no place to nest. So one of the things we did when we first moved back was we put up some wood duck nest boxes. And our first year, we just with 6 nest boxes, we hatched something like 50 wood ducks out of them. And I mean, they all got used in that first year. So, you know, it's apparent we have some similar problems here.
You know, we have so much more to learn from the natural world and how it works and how to make choices that are appropriate. And we do have to feed people at the same time. And so we can't let it all go wild, but making it work together is really important.
Instead of using chemicals to control weeds and pests, Greg and Raquel use varying water levels in careful ways to support their organic rice crops.
These weed control methods sort of, like the deep water is something, you know, my grandfather and great-grandfather used to do. And it went out of favor when you got herbicides to control your weeds, you didn't need to do it anymore. The drying up the fields came about just because there was an organic farmer whose weeds got totally out of control, and so he just decided to turn the water off and abandon it. And then as he watched the weeds dying before the rice, thought, well, maybe this is something we could try.
As biologists, Greg and Raquel are students of the natural world, and they try to learn about the roles of each plant and animal in the ecosystem.
Learning about each and every one and what their exact jobs are in the world and how very specific they are and what happens if one of them doesn't do its job and how that affects everybody else. And you feel a lot smaller as a person. You have so much respect for how valuable each and every organism is because it has worked itself out so well.
We farm almonds in addition to rice, and this time of year, they're in early spring, they're blooming, the small nuts are forming, getting pollinated and all that. So yeah, I have to check the weather every night to make sure it's not going to freeze, because if it freezes, it'll make the flowers go sterile, or, you know, if it's raining, the bees won't fly and won't pollinate the flowers. And we're definitely part of the world here, of the natural world.
To lower their energy consumption, they built their farmhouse out of rice straw, an otherwise problematic byproduct of growing rice that was traditionally burned in the field.
Our house is actually made of baled rice straw. It's a straw bale house, and you stack them like bricks to form your walls. So the walls in our house are actually 2 feet thick, and then it's covered with a cement stucco or plaster on both sides. And the reason we did it was mostly because we wanted an energy efficient house. We'd been living for years in an old leaky farmhouse. And it was impossible to keep cool and impossible to keep warm. We wanted a house that would stay, you know, a stable temperature all on its own.
Greg and Raquel have adopted 5 children, the last 3 of whom had been their foster children. For the masses, their sense of call to the care of creation in their farming methods is no different from their call to care for human creation.
That felt like a calling. I mean, it was a calling. It's something we needed to do. And we've struggled with this for so many years on the boundary between our family and other people in the world.
Let's just sit on your finger.
Whoa! I'm snapped its wings.
You care for people, you care for the environment, you care for animals. I mean, it's all the same, really, to me.
Caring for human creation also means providing quality food sold locally to people with whom Greg and Raquel can engage and interact.
Direct marketing and knowing people are actually eating your rice and liking it, and they come back to you every week and say, oh, I love your rice, that's a lot more fun.
Greg and Raquel discovered that to live out their high-risk call to farm differently, they needed the support and input of their faith community.
We couldn't be as outspoken and as big of risk takers or mavericks or whatever you want to call it without feeling like we were supported by pastors in the last few years that have been very supportive, and this is one of their passions, taking care of the earth. And we get very easily refreshed every Sunday, and you know, it just feels so good for people to say, oh, thank you for growing that rice. Your rice is so good.
Greg and Raquel have taken many risks for the sake of their children and of the earth. That takes moral courage.
I've been called a tree hugger more than once, but that's okay.
We get very frustrated with the culture of fear and how it paralyzes people and how it would keep us from doing a lot of the things we did if we worried about what could go wrong every time we make a choice. That's why I say we have enough support, or we have enough luck, or we have enough confidence that's just been instilled that it's worked, and we know it's worth it to take those risks. So, not to fear.
Raquel and Greg are committed to care for all of God's creation, and with the support of their church, family, and friends, they have ventured to live and work in harmony with God's world. It's a very biblical idea.
The more we think relationally about the larger world in which we live, about our place in it, the more we think communally, I think the truer we will be to the biblical material, and the more care we will use with respect to the larger environment of which we're part.
If I can dig a hole very well, and you can plant a seed very well, and then my sister can water very well, and my neighbor could weed very well, it frees me up to do the digging, which is what I do well. And community is, again, a way of lifting up the fact that we're in it together, that you don't have to do it by yourself.
An image that I carry is seeing ourselves as part of this cloud of witnesses throughout the ages. The past and the future and the present and all the continents, people seeking fallibly and always mistakenly, but still seeking to live in ways that do love neighbor and do serve the well-being of the earth.
Faced with what seem like insurmountable problems, we can easily feel powerless and alone. That's why God gives us family, friends, neighborhoods, communities, congregations, and many other institutions through which we might join with others in our earthbound calling. Seeing ourselves as a part of the web of creation is both humbling and empowering.
In the next session, we will see how our short-term thinking is harmful to creation, and how to think and act on a different timescale. After all, we are earthbound.
He's done that there's a lot of kind of concepts that require a lot of pondering and thinking about, that are really get exposed to quite a bit here. So I often come right at it and, well, what do you think? I've been getting a lot of like, I don't know. I got to take some time and think about that. But I do like to just kind of open it to see if there are any immediate kind of reactions that folks might have had with this week's presentation.
Can you hear okay, Jim and Judy and Terry?
Yeah, I think you're muted, Judy.
It's harder to hear Pastor with where he's sitting now than where he was before, but we'll try.
Can you hear this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Basically, I was just doing a very long, convoluted thing of any comments? Something changed in the 19th century. When humans began to distinguish nature from humans. If I'm not familiar with, was there a movement or was there
I think he was referring to the Enlightenment, and he referred to Descartes, who started to say, I think, therefore I am, which separated, it's not us, it's not a collective, it's I think, therefore I am. I am a separate entity from creation and from other human beings. And that's a real distinction between I think, therefore I am, and Ubuntu and other African concepts, or people of color communities or indigenous peoples who, I'm not separate from all of creation. I am integrally a part of it. And so that was the movement in the Enlightenment to distinguish us, and it separated thinking from body. It created this dichotomy that separated us from recognizing we are part of a communal whole. And it was that subject object we talked about.
And just to add, I think they were acknowledging there was a lot of powerful kind of stuff that came from that with the rise of science, and so as subjects observing nature, and observing the world, we learned a lot, about that. And so that kind of a lens or outlook on that has enabled us to do all kinds of different things. And to your question, Joe, you were mentioning like with the 19th century, that's more than we see the Industrial Revolution, and this idea of like, well, am I just a cog in the machinery, that's all kind of going along, and you get a lot more of that rise of then the individual, to say, what are my rights, or who am I, in the midst of this, so I'm not just going to be rolled over, by this whole process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate something Joyce was alluding to as well, that there have been, you mentioned about Ubuntu, and the idea, like I remember myself when I visited Zimbabwe, Lee Snook, the professor that was leading that trip, made the comment that the Enlightenment never really happened in the African nations, and so that wasn't a shift in thinking, and so it was an amazing way to just kind of experience this different outlook, with ordinary people, who lived their lives and were going about everything they were doing, but it was very much a different kind of a sense of not looking at subject object, but we're all community, together. And that's been around, but it's the dominant model has been very much that sense of subject object, the power that we can have over things, and kind of the implications then on the rest of the world. Yeah. So we have several centuries now of kind of Western Christianity looking at the Bible through that lens of subject object, kind of that Enlightenment lens. And it's amazing to actually read it and realize none of this was written from that kind of an outlook. We've sort of imposed that onto the Bible, but it wasn't written from that kind of an outlook at all.
I live a Christian life, so.
Right.
So I'm not responsible for what is happening in the world, as long as I personally follow the testimony.
Yeah, those of you on Zoom, any other comments that you would want to share, or reactions or thoughts from the video?
I'm always interested when the agriculture comes in.
Yeah.
Because I'm in a family of a farmer in Indiana who has received awards for being a conservation-minded big farmer, but not by my definition. And then our daughter works for Green America, and one of their big emphasis right now and probably forever is sustainable farming. So to have our daughter and my brother in the same room is interesting, but they mostly just don't talk about it. But I thought about a film that Christy recommended, Kiss the Dirt. Has anyone seen that?
No.
It's really good. I'll look into it. Maybe we can share it sometime.
I know another one I've seen, and I think Tom Golding was mentioning this as well. It's called The Biggest Little Farm. But that's another interesting story about a couple who goes in to they buy an old kind of farmed out area or piece of land and want to create an organic farm there, and it kind of tells their story. But yeah, there's some inspiring, kind of examples of this all around, that we, even close to our congregation, Thelma Heidel Baker, who advised us with our prairie planting. She and her husband have an organic farm in, I think it's Fredonia or Random Lake, I think. They're doing organic raising of cattle, and they provide eggs and beef. And I'm not sure, like with crops, I think it's more like grazing, but I think it's kind of the cattle that they really raise. But yeah, it's a real adventure, to go and do that. In the midst of an industrialized kind of approach to farming where it's more rewarding big, and you have to really go big or get out. Yeah, I think this was made in 2011. 2010, 2011. So yeah, it's a good question.
My family lives with that same reality as Judy, that the farm I grew up in west of here, my brother and now my nephew who's running it, they use the pesticides and all of that stuff. And my niece married into the Wiedeberg family who started Organic Valley down in the rolling hills. So Jim Wiedeberg, now his father-in-law, travels all over the world talking about organic farming, and Jake and Jim, the two sons, do that. So we've been saying we need to get together, and my niece just finished landscape architecture. She spent time in Senegal twice. She's really concerned about sustainable agriculture around the world. So we have some interesting pieces within the family to talk about what does all of this mean of how we farm, how we create food for the world, and yet do it in ways that are sustainable.
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that, Joyce, and with what Judy was sharing as well. I thought about the emphasis of the video on community and thinking in terms of community. And we're sort of figuring that out right now because we're heirs of this individualism as well. And so it's like, well, here's this one political outlook over here. Here's this other political outlook over here. Well, which one is the better one, or which one is going to win? But to think of things through the lens of community, it's like, okay, we're family. There's different approaches here, but how can we work this out? How can we kind of but I appreciated the message of this video that when we start to think communally, it changes us, and that's a challenge. I felt myself convicted, even in my approach to ministry, I've been shaped by that kind of individual thinking, and you all are telling me all the time, there's other people here who are willing to do this, or work with things. Nope, I got to do it myself.
No, you just have to dig the hole.
Yeah.
We'll dig the holes. You plant the seed.
But it's hard. It's hard to get around that, and we default to what we are used to. What we've been told, and it's challenging. I would imagine, Judy, with what you were sharing, that's some interesting conversations with Christy, and then your family, with kind of farming But how powerful that could be, if we dare to do that, or engage in that kind of way. And we might not all agree, but there's wonderful possibilities there.
Right.
Very large scale organic farming and sustainable farming.
Organic Valley is all of that. So all of those rolling hills in the western part of the state by the Mississippi. So Amanda and Jake's wedding, they have 400 people because they had to invite the whole county because everybody is so involved with their family through Organic Valley that it's all of these farmers that are a co-op in Organic Valley, and then that spreads beyond that. So it is pretty large, and they milk quite a few cows. They just graze them and raise them differently, and that 3 years of converting is hard before you can do it again.
Although, Joe, there's another way, I guess, that question could be viewed, as far as scale. And like, are there any examples of really, really huge industrial organic farms? And I think that's telling that Organic Valley is a big operation, but it's a cooperative and it's a network of small farms, because that has less impact when you are more connected that way, with farmers who know their land and are working with that, as opposed to an industrialized kind of an approach where it maybe is going to be cheaper that way and faster and everything, but it's more damaging. So two different ways of talking about scale.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I think the big farmers shut down the conversation pretty quickly by saying we feed the world. And they have statistics about that. Of course, they actually, do feed the world with very little acreage now. And compared to what it used to be when there were so many small sustainable farms, but they have to feed the world and they can't be picking the bugs off by hand. So that's why they shut down the conversation. I know there are movements to get beyond that, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
What has been most frustrating to me throughout decades is everything has to be politicized. You're put into this certain club and there's no communication. Conservative and liberal terms don't mean anything to me. I think these farmers in the film probably would have been considered liberals, yet they're conservatives trying to conserve the earth and preserve it for future generations.
Golding was going to add something in there too, Tom.
Well, my experience down in Chicago, organic farming. Generally, I think organic farming is much more labor intensive than industrialized farming. That almost forces us to have more community because we have to get the people that dig the whole plant of seeds to utilize whatever. So it's almost like equation that's got to work one.
Yeah.
The other question I have is there seems to be a tension between personal responsibility and equity of community. Because when we talk about personal responsibility, we're talking about how we act as individuals. And yet we want to be able to act in community. So I don't know that I fully understand how that works. So anybody has a better idea on how that works?
That might be a holdover from our individualistic way of thinking, that even for us to talk about this, we have to focus in on personal responsibility. And it's hard for us to think communally. Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. I was thinking too, with whether we do like organic kind of farming or an industrialized kind of approach, whatever way we choose, there's costs and benefits to both of those kinds of things, but it's important for us to be thinking about what those are. So as Judy was saying, we feed the world, so there's a benefit that comes from this. What does it cost us to feed the world in that kind of a way? And what does it cost us to do more organic farming? But what are the benefits that come from that? But then that is more of a collective conversation, in a sense of collective responsibility, I guess. Yeah, Esther.
personal responsibility to the collective. So the personal responsibility isn't just about what's best for yourself. Personal responsibility may be for caring for the other.
Sure.
I don't think it has to be, it shouldn't be at best, but given the health of the
That's nice, but I think what happens is we start trying to shirk responsibility and put what bad in our life onto the community, and that's a lot of it nowadays. That's when that tension exists, and I think we've got to find a better way that we're solving that tension in a way that we can work as a community, and at the same time, be personally responsible for what happens to the community. I don't think we're ready yet.
Yeah, that temptation to pass the buck is a strong one. Yeah.
You know what's interesting for me is that revolving around agriculture and farming. And in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking of the Rocket County right now. That there used to be all small farms. Now it's all subdivisions. And where does this community get involved? How does the community in large cities that never see country, how do you live together? Where does this individualism versus community? In a sense, city is community, but so individually, I gotta be better than the community.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of helping them with the trying to be better.
What I kind of find too that's interesting is we tend to frame this as like regulating, or rules or something like that, and nobody wants to be told what to do, or kind of like who's in charge, as opposed to a different way of looking, seeing, the world, to see my actions affect you and your actions affect me. How can we act for the benefit of a common good? To lift that up. And that takes creativity and courage, to be able to do that kind of a thing and dialogue, in conversation. But we tend to frame it all, to pass that off again, like, well, don't tell me what to do. I don't want to do that. I can do whatever I want.
You have to have a very clear vision. That's a start.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to be able to communicate that vision within the community. Because without that, it's really messy and constantly not a good place.
Right.
I think it's interesting how people what we talked about outside and how they're in the city. And not just in Milwaukee, they're finding that people are able to build community around the city. So even so that it's important to have fun and shared space.
We're doing it right here.
Exactly. As far as growing and gardening in Milwaukee, there are a lot of stuff that you can find out where people, that is where people are building community by using that.
Yeah.
I'll introduce a slightly different topic. I was reading this morning, Washington Post.
Oh, geneticists? Yeah.
How they're actively altering genes and plants to adapt to human material. And so it's obviously a slippery slope, but to create a totally floral yeast, that can just let it dry and warm the body. And it's like mammals that that are subject to viruses, and they can weeds or whatever, they can inject protein in that makes them more resilient to pests. So we've always been involved in creation. The dog that we
You say that's a good thing. I wasn't talking about the dog. But it seems like we're going to do more and more of that to survive in the world. And so we're doing more like that as we adapt the world. Yeah, it always is. I mean, there's two sides, you know, to that kind of as well. And it's the complexity, I guess, of the world. It's amazing, you know, but also when I think about the interconnectedness of complexity, when we start tinkering with one part of it, it has ripple effects kind of down the road. And what are the unforeseen, you know, kind of effects that may have? But the other side is, do we have any choice almost right now? I heard it put engineering for profit is what kind of got us into the mess that we're in. It's going to take engineering for the common good to get us out of it. You know, with my eye and kind of think about how do we solve these problems, you know?
Having civilization gain, having a common wealth that gains, having to be able to express the vision and live with that vision, how we can all.
Yeah, maybe I should
benefit from.
Yeah, I should qualify
As an
that.
engineer, I take offense.
Yeah, maybe engineering for personal profit, you know, or for individual profit.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And engineering just after them, that's what we have to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, think back to what you said, Wayne, about that individualism and the competition, because individualism then leads to competition, where you said it's all about me and mine, and that's located within a mentality of scarcity. So if there's a scarcity, then I need to be in competition with the other person as an individual in order to get my piece of the pie. When we think about a communal, that leads us to collaboration. And how do we work together and seeing a mentality of abundance, and that God's creation is large enough for us to collaborate within it for the good of the community, but that's a whole different way of looking at things.
Yeah. I think Kate Erickson next Sunday is going to probably touch on this, you know, but, and Larry Rasmussen kind of touched on it too with that subject-object split. If the world is just object, then it's resources, it's garbage dump, you know, it's whatever, you know, I'm going to use it for whatever way that I want to. But if it's part of the community, that's a whole different spin, you know, and a different way of appreciating things. You know, and one of the phrases for those of you who went out to Pine Ridge, I'm going to say it wrong, Mishakwe Oasin, all my relations, you know, we are all related, you know, all my relatives, but that's a common thread through a different way of thinking, I guess, you know, and I'm excited to hear what Kate will have to share, you know, thinking about land.
So when you see the rest of the world, right, that they're also feeling each other, so that people become exposed, people become really diverse, and yeah. So it's not just everything else.
Yeah, well, and it was a brief part of that segment, but where do we locate our incinerators and our dumps, you know, and where does all the waste go? And who lives there? Somebody lives there, you know.
He asked about one of the problems is what large industrial farming is the gas amounts of fertilizers that then work their way into common water.
Right. Yeah. So we are about at an hour, I think, with our discussion. I guess I handed out this worksheet, but I think we kind of covered a lot of the stuff on there, and you can take that with you and with whatever notes, you know, you have on there. But interesting to think about these concepts of freedom, self-sufficiency, individual rights, personal responsibility. What are the benefits? What are the dangers? You know, with that, and we're not going to wave a magic wand and suddenly make the world a different place, you know, but it's kind of how we approach and how we think about this. And I am grateful with this series. They ground it very much in kind of the biblical story and a sense of kind of what is our theology? How do we understand that and talk about it? And there's a lot of resources for us to find, you know, to help us in the work that we're called to now. Okay, well, thanks everybody for sticking around. Terry and Jim and Judy, anything you wanted to add before we go?
No, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
Pastor John, I do want to tell you what a great job that was with that panel this week.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, you did a great job.
Thanks. I went actually to the school board meeting too, and there were a lot of people who got up to comment. You know, this was what Jim is referring to. There was a panel on the school boards moving towards restricting public comment, you know, to say that they're going to limit that, you know, and I think that was specifically in response to, there's a mother who has her biracial children have experienced attacks in the Cedarburg School District, and she's been bringing that to the board and asking for action on it. They have not taken action on it, and now they're moving to limit comment to so that you can't come and bring that. But a lot of folks got up and spoke, and I hope that the board was really hearing that, you know, that the community does not want to see that happen. So, but thank you, Jim. I appreciate the feedback. All right, thanks everybody. We'll pick it up again next week. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.